This video concentrates only on the making of the shirt. If you want the introduction or the explanation to the pattern, then please visit the project page and the link to that is in the video description. Let's have a look at the parts where we use iron-on interfacing. On the collar, it goes on the contrast, and on the stand, it goes on the shell fabric. And then when we've got this together, it peeps out a little bit. And of course, if the collar is stood up, you know, if you flip it up, you see that lovely polka dot on the inside. Again, that has got the iron-on interfacing on it. So now let's have a look at the placket. You already put the snips in, so you iron over where your snips are, and where the wider side is, you also going to iron on your violin. Then you iron both of them together, and then that is ready to go on later on. Now you don't necessarily need to put on violin, you could just iron it over, that would be absolutely fine as well. It depends on how thick your fabric is. So if you have a fairly stiff fabric, sometimes with a violin it actually gets too thick. One of the sides is wider, and that is because that is the side that's going to fold over on the outside, and it's just easier. There's no other reason for it. Now I'm going to fold this over, and the shorter side I'm also ironing 1 millimeter shorter, and that's just so it fits on better and it absolutely grasps and I don't have to worry about it. Mark on the back where you want the couching elastic to go. You only need to mark the upper part because the next lot of rows is going to be foot width to that one. It's about 11 centimeters wide, so once you've marked that, you're ready to go. On the front, we also want to mark 2 lines where we're going to put our ribbon or our pleat. You can also cut out the pockets so we know where to position it later. This is how it all goes together. The back fits onto the yoke here, and then we have no shoulder seam. The yoke goes all the way to the front and is attached to the front part, and I line it with a lovely contrast fabric. I'm also going to use some embroidery, so to make sure that it doesn't crinkle up, I put some violin underneath it. That's iron-on interfacing. It doesn't have to be done prettily or anything, just, you know, cut yourself some strips and bang them on there. Now, if you want to put a ribbon in, you need to sew it on first, otherwise it will rip out, and then we're going to do a stitch from the outside to hold it in place. So pin that in and then sew it in. You could use a zigzag stitch just to make sure that it holds in a little bit better, but as long as you use smaller stitches, it's okay. Fold the next line that you've marked over so it covers this bit, and then you stitch that in as well. Again, I wouldn't use a really big stitch because it might still rip out. So to make this secure, do the stitch length 2.5. That's what automatically comes up on your sewing machine anyway. And if you don't want to do this, you can just put a little pleat in and you put the 2 lines on top of each other. You mark either side of that line and then you're going to sew that down. And when that's done, we're going to iron it flat. Gives you like a mini box pleat, which I think is really nice. And then from the front, we are going to top stitch very close. It's about 1 stitch over from the seam line, and then another stitch on the other side. Sew that down. You can also just do a pleat in one direction, and you can also stitch that one down. That's just preference. Now let's start with the pockets. They are really easy to do because all we're doing is putting the right sides together, and then we're going to close it all the way around, and we're leaving an opening gap here. Your seam allowance is 1 centimeter or foot width. It really doesn't matter which one you choose. It's just a millimeter or two difference anyway, isn't it? So make sure that your needle is down when you change over. So needle down, lift the presser foot, turn and go up. But I assume if you're making this shirt, you already know how to sew fairly well. Now that this is done, we cut back, but not the area where we are going to turn, and then we're turning it, going in, picking the part furthest away from our little gap, and we're pushing that through, and then we work out all our rounds, and we stick in where we have the gap and iron it really nicely. Then we want to fold this over and make sure that none of the jeans type fabric shows. We're going to iron it like that, and then you turn it down to how you like it. So that's a bit down to preference. I never really measure that. I just think, oh, that looks good, so I do that. To get the other pocket looking exactly the same, we just put it over the top and we fold the top part back to the right amount, and then we press it. Now we're going to top stitch just above where we have got this fold line. I'm using the triple stitch, but you don't have to do that. You can just use a normal stitch, and you just end just over the fold line again. To position our pocket, we need to first iron this pleat a little bit that we've got here. And you might have seen this on clothing. The dart actually goes into the pocket. We could have sewn a dart, but I think this looks really, really nice actually. So now take your pattern again to check that you've got your pocket in the right position. And all you have to do is place that in there. And that should be fairly much where it needs to go. I'm also making sure it's aligned with the front, so I need to like move mine a tiny little bit, so make sure that that's straight. And now we're going to pin this in and top stitch it. And again, I'm going to use my triple stitch, so fold the top down and now start exactly on that crease again. I'm using a triple stitch, so if you are going to do that, you line it up with the edge of the fabric there. That I've got that little red line on my presser foot, and I always line up to that one. That works really well for me. So make sure that when you turn with the needle stuck in the fabric, that it's on the forward motion, otherwise you get that horrible ziggy-zaggy look, which is not very nice. We go around and we come up the other side. Make sure that you stop again exactly in the crease. Now we're going to do the couching. So you wrap that round the bobbin. I'm doing it quite tightly, and then put that into your bobbin case. And I am bringing up the thread because I want it to hang really long. I don't want the automatic cutter in here. So really pull it so you've got quite a bit hanging there. We're going to tie those ends off later, so can't be too short. Reduce the tension to 3 or even 2 if you like. 3 works fine for my machine. And then I'm going to lock in my stitches. I know you shouldn't do that with couching. I'm by nature quite lazy when it comes to things like that. So, and it worked fine. So you can do it. You can lock it in and then take it to the other side and lock it in again. And when you pull it out, you want lots of thread standing again. Pull it, and we do the next line, and that's foot width now. And we do exactly the same. We lock it in where we start, and then we lock it in where we end. And then we pull it, so we've got a lot to go. And you can do 3, 4, 5 lines. Next, we're going to do our piping, and the piping cord lies inside my bias binding strip. and then that will be sewn on and it'll just peep out from under the yoke. So when you do this, it's quite important that the needle is not moved all the way to the edge. You want it a little bit loose, that piping cord at this point, and you can see here that I am using a zipper foot. I am not using piping foot because mine I actually can't locate. I don't know where it is. I will find it eventually, but you can do it with a zipper foot. It's on some machines it's quite difficult, but on this puff it's really, really easy. So if you've got a puff, this is the way to go. Now I'm sewing it onto the back part, and again I make sure that it's still a little bit loose. I'm not having my needle on the edge. We're only going to do that when we put the lining over the top. So with my piping secured in, I am now going to put my yoke over the top, right sides together, and then I turn it over because it's far easier to always sew from the side where you can already see the stitch line, obviously, so that when you're doing the final stitch you know that you're sewing a little bit to the left of it, so it's covered. All the way, and you can see it's still a little bit loose in there, but it's already looking good. I also put my piping onto the front yoke, and now I fold my front back and I attach it in the same way again. This time I actually pin it because there's a curve in there and I don't want it to push out. Also the piping will hold this seam which is on the bias in shape, so that's really good. So you don't need any more Vilene underneath there or anything else. So we're doing the same again. I'm moving my needle all the way over to the left, and then I actually move it back too, because at this point we don't want it in as snug yet. And there we go, almost tight, but not quite. It's very, very slim piping cord I'm using. In fact, it's like a curtain cord. Now I'm going to put on the lining of the back yoke here. And now it's really important that you go dead close to your piping. So move the needle over for as far as you can go to the left, so it's really, really snug, and then with your fingers hold your piping, really push against that presser foot. And now when that's done, it's really fine and it's very slim and slender and it's lovely. Now let's have a look how we do the front. If I end up the seam allowance, you don't have to do that, but I've done that just so that you can see it better what I'm doing here. So now that seam allowance needs to be turned in as well because they need to lie on top of each other. So you just grab that end here and put a pin in there, then you know where that's right. So now you can pull the other part, pull it all the way through, go on. And then I just pin it too. So it's actually quite easy. When I was an apprentice, I used to just like turn it in and then pin it. And then I used to hand stitch it in because I didn't understand this step. And I'm hoping I'm saving you this trouble because actually that's just daft. So you want to pin that in really nicely. And now we're going as close as we can again to the piping cord. And of course, because we're sewing it always from the side where you can see the stitching line, you make sure that you are to the left of the last stitching line that you've done, and it'll be fine. And there you go. That looks absolutely lovely. Now all I have to do is cut it back, and I cut it back in stages so that it's not all in the same place and makes that seam like really thick, especially because we know we want to do some embroidery on it. So if that seam gets into the way, that would not be very good at all. So I also go into a smaller space at the top. So what I want to do is cut out some triangles So snip one way and then you turn your fabric the other way, snip again, and there you have your triangles, and that will make sure that it's nice and light and slim and lies flat. You can see it there. So now we give this a really good press, and I can't say this enough. Pressing between stages is so important. Now we do the back as well. You'll never get in like this again, you say. So, and also if it's puckered up a bit, you can steam it. Now we're going to do some embroidery, and I'm so predictable. I just chose the hearts. They were the most amazing embroidery stitches, and I go for this one, but I like hearts. So just make sure that your hearts are actually the right way up. So put your presser foot next to the piping and just guide it along. And if you think, oh, how can you get it upside down? Well, I did. I only did about 3 hearts, but I had to unpick them, so I didn't like that very much. And also I was very impressed with the stitching formation of this. So this Pfaff Quilt Expression 2.0 I've got is like really amazing. But when I was doing it, I've actually sewn in one of these ties. That was right there, and I had to cut it. You can still see it here. So I have to do that again, take it out and do another tie. So make sure that you don't sew in it and have them well out of the way. And then I just tie up my couching elastic as well. Apparently that's what you have to do. If anybody knows how to do it better than me, please let me know. You know, comment box is just below. Cut it off short. At least that's how I do it. And then that's it. Now we can work the placket on the front. So I'll take my pre-prepared plackets. Oh, and the birds are singing for me too. And put this under, turn the piece over, and then you can pin it in, and you can either sew the 1 centimeter or in your crease. It should both be the same. There we go, that rolls to the outside, and of course that's much easier than to top stitch it here from either side. It's dead easy. Now you roll it over to the front, and we're going to top stitch it. If you're top stitching, I would recommend that you use a stitch length of 3.5, so it's not too small. And you do need to hold your fabric front and back and really hold it taut, because it will want to push. You've got seam allowances in there, you've got some fabric with violin on, some without, so really pull and kind of keep it steady under the machine, and then you do the side as well, and placket's finished. Now we're going to do the cuffs. Now there are 3 different ways to do a cuff, and the 2 other ways, I explained in a separate video. But for this one, where we're going to use bias binding to help us out, we're closing the seams first, and then we're opening out the seam, and then we're putting the seams together so that the right sides are to the outside. And to hold this in place while we're working, we're going to stitch around either side of our cuff. And now we can put our bias binding on. This is like one which has lace at the top. It's really heavy, really thick, and I really like it because it can slip and slide and it doesn't push. So I'm overlapping my seam a little bit, and then I stitch it in quite close to the edge actually, and make sure that the rough edge of your cuff is right in there on the right hand side. And then when it's overlapped a little bit, I stop and I just cut it off. There's no need really to turn this in or anything. I think that would make it really thick and horrible. So I'm just cutting this off. Bias binding anyway doesn't fray because it's on the bias. It's not like, you know, threads can't go anywhere anyway, and it looks really lovely. Now we're going to prepare the sleeve for this. So we're putting some gather threads onto the edge, all the way around the curve of your sleeve. So one's close to the edge and then the next one foot width next to that. You can also, of course, put the gather threads in at the lower part of the sleeve where you have the snips where you gather the lower part, but I forgot that there, and I closed the seam first and then I'm doing it. But of course you could have done between these two spaces there straight away. Now you need to put the cuff inside so that the side you want to show lies against the seam allowance of the sleeve. And then you just tuck this in, and the rule here is to pin always to that very first snip on the one side, and then you come in on the other side again to the snip, and then you pull, and your gathers need to be central to those two snips on the side. So you could have also snipped the center part, which I did, and then you know that, but the gathers lie slightly towards the back, not central on the cuff. Yeah, they need to be central to those snips. And then I can sew this in. Again, I want to be sewing from the inside of the cuff. That makes it easier. And I lost my pins there. I also think it's a little bit easier to sew from that side because the gathers lie underneath. And when you turn this up, you can see how lovely that's going to look. But there's one step we need to do first, and that is to overlock it. So you put it under, and what I also do is I always scrunch it up in my hands. And if I feel a pin, I know it needs to come out, because if the pin hits the knife, it's really, really an expensive mistake. Then we iron the seam downwards, and we can just turn over our cuff and give it a really good press with lots of steam all the way around. And then all we need to know is to sew in the seam to secure it to the underarm seam. Now if you make a bob standard collar, then you sew all the way around with the right sides facing each other, but we are going to make a collar which is bound, so we have the right sides on the outside, and then we put the bias binding on. Now I would suggest that if you are a fairly new sewer, I wouldn't start with this method. I would do the bob standard collar. If you have got some experience, then this is a really good one to check out. You need to make sure that you keep moving the collar around into the bias binding, not the other way around, because that's just gonna cause it to slip off. And then you can use a pin to help you out. Your nails, your fingers, just don't sew into them, and make sure that the fabric really is tucked in there. And the curve is quite difficult, but then when you get into the straight, it's actually really easy with this fantastic bias binding that I've got with a little bit of lace on the edge. And that's really easy, but then you get to the curve again, and let's face it, that's really isn't an easy task to do. So if you've done that and you got it in well, then well done to you. Give it a good press, and we have got a fabulous collar. If you were doing the regular collar, then you need to cut back, of course, turn it, and then, not like me with every single shirt, I forget to top stitch. After you press this really well, so it's nice and flat, you need to top stitch all the way around, and your stitch length should be 3.5 for this. And there's a collar. Now on the boy shirt that I did, I was working from the outside to the inside. Here I want to show you the other way, and that's from the inside to the outside. So the collar needs to go onto the facing of the collar stand, so that both the contrast fabrics facing upwards, and then I stitch right next to the edge to hold it in place. And now I can put the collar on. The collar stand needs to just overlap by 1 centimeter, and then I pin it all the way across. And again on that side, 1 centimeter over, and I'm pinning it to the wrong side of the shirt. Don't forget this, yeah? You need to now work from the inside because we're rolling to the outside. And that is actually quite an easy way to do your top stitching. If that's always been a problem that you kind of didn't catch what was underneath, then this is the way for you. This is quite difficult, especially when you've not done it before, because you're coming around the shoulder curve and the fabric does want to pleat underneath it. So you need to make sure that it's really straight. And for everyone that is fairly new to this, what you can do is put the collar on afterwards. So just put the collar stand on. If you've got any left on the other side, I mean, it's not ideal, but you can then just trim it and then put the collar on, and the collar will still be in the center. So you can do that. It's not ideal, but it makes it a little bit easier for all your starters there. So go to the end. And now we need to press this first. So we're pressing the seam into the collar stand. And these little steps of ironing are so important. Can't emphasize that enough. If you don't go and iron this first, it'll come out all wonky, trust me. Now we're going to put on the other part of the collar stand, and that's in the shell fabric. And all we have to do is put a pin here, turn it over, and then we can pin it all the way around. And we're going to sew up straight next to the placket all the way around. And I reduce the stitch length where I have a curve. You could also mark the curve with a pencil line or a chalk line so you know where you have to sew, but you don't have to do that. And this is so much easier than doing the collar first and then putting it on. Like, I've seen that everywhere. I haven't actually seen anybody show it like this, and I'm so line it up to where you just could see my thumb there. That should be the edge as you go around the curve, and then all the way to the other end. I think I'm going to do some really easy items next, because although this is very interesting for all you guys, hardly anybody buys this stuff. I gotta live. So now we cut back the seam here, but leave the shell fabric at the bottom standing so that we can fold it in nicely. And again, another bit of ironing this time. We're going to make sure that this is all nicely ironed down, because we're going to turn in the seam allowance and pin it. And if it's not ironed down, well, you might not get it in the right position. So now, nice and taut, turn it in and then cover the seam line. If you're working the other way around from the outside to the inside, you wouldn't want to cover the line. You'd be slightly above it, just above it. And here you want to slightly cover it, so just on it really. And then you pin with pins which are vertical to the seam so that you can literally take them out when your needle is hitting in there, so nothing can move. I wouldn't use horizontal ones there. I do it always like this and it works a treat. So now I'm starting at the middle of the collar to sew, because that's what you won't be seeing. So you never want to start at the beginning, you know, just where the placket is and everybody looks at it. And then you move around the curve really carefully and needle down, you know, move the presser foot up and turn. And also where we're coming down to this area here, I actually do do it very close to the edge because it's the outside and I'm folding it in. I don't want this to look gapey. So I'm very close to the edge there. And then I pull the pins out as I go. And of course it's easier because on the inside it will absolutely grasp, right? So it's a matter of preference. Sometimes I work this way, sometimes I work the other way. I like both ways, but this definitely for a beginner is the easier option. Come back up. You might have to pull a bit because where you have the placket and all this fabric, even a very good machine gets stuck. So you want to make sure that you're prepared for that and that you help your fabric out a bit and you pull and you push a bit. And there you go, you've done a collar. That wasn't so hard, was it? And now we can do our side seam. Oh, we're getting to the end. You can pin this, but you don't have to. I mean, it's fairly straight, right? So you could just sew it and then overlock it straight after. Again, make sure all the pins are removed before you go on the overlocker. Cut off any nasty bits. And then we're going to iron that seam towards the center back. Always iron side seams to the center back. There we go. You could now also top stitch this from the outside if you liked. Because this is a girly shirt, I didn't want it to be too masculine or sporty, I left it out. Now, on your sleeve, there is a snip. That snip indicates the front, so put it onto one of your arms. If the snip is at the back, you've got the wrong sleeve. And then go with the right sleeve through the right armhole and pin it on the underarm seam first. And then you can also pin the head of the sleeve where you've got your snips. So marking everything when you're cutting out is really important because otherwise you wouldn't quite know. I have, however, found out that the gathers look really good when they start at the beginning of the yoke. So that is kind of where it needs to be anyway, but I would make sure that I have gathers there. Now I want to show you my little trick here for putting in a sleeve. I go by the rule of 2 pins of bringing in the sleeve flat. 1 and 2. And I do that either side always when I put in a sleeve. So even when I'm just holding it in at the top and it's not gathered, I do this. For adult clothes, probably be 3 pins because it's bigger. So, and then you see how much you've got left and how much you need to gather. And then you pick up the top 2 threads and you pull those. And the rule is that you should have 4 centimeters from either side of the sleeve head. But in this case, to be honest, do it from the beginning of the yoke and go up 8 centimeters. 4 centimeters really looks good. So altogether, always 8. Just check, is it 8? And then you're golden, really. I would also check on a tailor dummy or hang it over your arm. Have a look what it actually looks like. There are so many people, I had this in courses, they don't even look at their sleeve. They pin it and they sew it in and they think it's magic. It's not. You have to check it and you have to adjust it if it's not quite right. This is how it should look. Then you're going to put the sleeve in nice and flat. Make sure nothing is bunched up underneath it. There you go. And your stitch line now should lie right between those 2 gather lines that you put in. That's 1 centimeter. And that makes sure that the gathers are really nice and even. So you can't just put 1 gather thread in. It doesn't work. It won't be very tidy. You need 2 gather threads, 1 close to the edge and 1 foot width. And in the center of that is going to be a centimeter seam allowance. So now I've put this in, make very sure again that you have got no pins in there, bunch it up a little bit in your hands just to feel it, because I have left pins in and we don't want that, because those knives on the overlock are very expensive. They're £30. That is a lot of money. So then we overlock it, and again make sure you can see I'm overlocking from the inside. That's always the thing, otherwise it's very easy to cut into the fabric. And there we go. Now just a little tip here for ironing. Some people actually iron across. Never ever do that. You iron the sleeve flat. So when people talk about iron the sleeve flat, this is what they mean. You just make sure that what you've just stitched and the overlocking and everything is nicely together. And then you steam where you have got the gathers, but you do not force that down ever. And I'm doing my little cuff again, and I haven't filmed this. I don't think there's need for it really. You need to secure it now on the underarm seam so it can't roll up, and this is what I've done. Just where you have the seam, you stitch a few, no, what is it, 1.5 centimeters I think, upwards, and that's it, and the sleeve's done. Now we can get on to the hem. Because I had a fabric with a percentage of elastane, it's very easy to get around the curves. Now on any fabric that doesn't have any stretch in it, it's not easy. So I would recommend that you pin that. Of course, on this fabric, I didn't need to really pin it. If you wanted to see some more versions of how you could do this a little bit simpler or differently to get around having to do the curve, then there are a couple of videos for you on the project page. And any real beginner that is just desperate to make this, even though they're really not quite ready for it, right, I would overlock the bottom, and then you turn that up and you just stitch it down. That's a lot easier. It doesn't look as nice, of course, but it's a way around it. Finally, we're going to put in our buttonhole. So you fold over the placket and then you mark the lower part of the buttonhole. And we are also going to mark the center so that we can position the needle when we put it under the sewing machine, and then we'll go. But first of all, we have to reduce the tension to 3. That's very important, because otherwise the buttonhole will look a little bit funny. I've chosen a really lovely round buttonhole. In fact, I made many shirts and I changed the buttonhole on every one of them, and I think the round ones were my favorite. That's number 37. So I put 37 in, tick it, and I'm ready to go. I've got a hard button which will not fit into my buttonhole foot, so I choose a button which has the same diagonal dimensions, and put that one in to help me out. And then I put that on the sewing machine, and we're golden. Right, move off your feet, get rid of the IDT, special support foot at the back, and then you put on your buttonhole foot. Move down the sensor. The sensor I find so annoying, because every time you touch it, it resets itself and the buttonhole becomes like half the size or something. So you have to be very careful not to touch that little beastie. On the mechanical machines, it just doesn't do that, and that's so much better. But on the upside, the buttonhole is absolutely crazy good with this one. So you go down exactly where you have your little cross and then line it up nice and straight on either side. And then we're going to put the buttonhole in. Sometimes I just reset the machine totally if I think I've touched that sensor. I sometimes do that 3 times because I'm so scared of having to unpick these silly buttonholes. And of course it does happen, and it happened on this shirt as well. One of the buttonholes was not working, and that's because at the area where the piping of the yoke came down, I haven't cut it back far enough. So make sure that when you do yours, where the placket hits the piping, make sure it's cut back, and look at that buttonhole. It's just fab. And this was just blended in how the little buttonhole was. I had to unpick that and do it again. So the top buttonhole needs to sit 1.5 millimeters over, so that makes sure that it's nice and straight in the front. And I'm going to put this in again, and I do the same thing. And you can see my hands really holding the fabric flat either side, so nothing touches my sensor. And then I pray, and then it's done. And basically all we have to do now is to put the buttons on, which I'm not showing on here. I expect that you know how to cut open a buttonhole. You can always watch the boy shirt for that if you really want to know. There are so many different options, so go on my project page and check them all out for the different cuffs, putting lace in, putting just a row of piping in. Every time you do something like that, the methods change. So I hope you have fun with this one, and thank you for watching. Bye.